pass directly over to Kevin, who will kick off today's session for us. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Suzanne. So hello, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to HK's first presentation on the energy transition. So this is part one of a two-part series. So I want to talk about what the actual energy transition is, and I'll describe to you in the next few slides in a high-level overview of what the energy transition is, what it means to the industry, and then I'll pass you over to Neil, and Neil will go into the four main sectors within the energy transition, and he will give you a little bit more detail on each sector. So first of all, what is the energy transition? Well, it's the move or the shift from fossil fuels to renewable and sustainable forms of energy. And why do we need to move away from carbon-based fuels? Well, as most of us will already know, the world is warming at an alarming rate due to CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. And if you do not change course now, we are heading towards a climate catastrophe. If you look at the graph opposite, you'll see here the dark blue line shows an increase in CO2 levels from 1850, which is pre-industrial levels, and the lighter blue line is the increase in temperatures, which directly follows the increase in CO2 levels over that period to present day, which is showing about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Unfortunately, the current trajectory is we're going to hit 3 degrees by the end of this century. So the Paris Climate Agreement set a target of keeping global temperature rises below 2 degrees by the end of the century, with an optimum level of 1.5 degrees. And governments have set new legislation, such as the UK has set net zero emissions by 2050, the EU has set the same by 2050, and China has set theirs by 2060, and now the US has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. So if we look at the potential market, we will see that the global renewables economy is valued at $42.5 trillion by 2050 and will create 30 million jobs. In comparison, the onshore and offshore upstream market, oil and gas market, is valued at 1.45 trillion by 2040. However, jobs are expected to reduce by approximately 65% by then. The global hydrogen market is valued at $2.5 trillion per annum in 2050. And from now to 2030, the UK offshore wind market will increase by 400% to meet UK targets of 40 gigawatts. It's estimated that the new wave of renewable projects would inject about 20 billion of private investment into the economy, and jobs will increase between 11,000 to 27,000. Also, exports are expected to increase from half of a billion to 2.5 billion per year by then. So as you can see, the market is huge. Now, all of this will put a huge strain on the existing and the future supply chains. Offshore wind alone will not be sufficient to meet these targets. It is widely accepted that other technologies will be needed to help reduce emissions, such as hydrogen production, carbon capture and storage, biomass, solar, and energy storage. The scaling up in capacity will be the biggest hurdle that the UK will face, from accelerated planning, approval, investment, development, construction, and installation, to operation and maintenance. All of this will place a huge strain on the existing supply chain, on manufacturing, on SMEs, on government bodies, and on training. So if this is not achieved, we will fail to meet these targets. Therefore, we must speed up the transition faster, which will require governments around the world to commit to post-COVID-19 investment in low or zero carbon sustainable solutions, raising carbon taxation, accelerating green energy projects, increased electrification, grid infrastructure, and an increase in energy efficiency. If you look at the government plans, we know that the UK government has committed to a 10-point green energy revolution plan, which focuses on the skills needed to achieve net zero and identify solutions to provide short-term and long-term skilled labour with increased diversity and to support the transition from high carbon industries and develop recommendations for government strategies for businesses and education. In 2020, the government produced its energy white paper, which outlines what must be done to combat climate change. This year, the UK will host COP26 in Glasgow, which presents a fantastic opportunity for the UK government to set out its policies regarding its commitment to reducing carbon emissions and how this will be achieved. So, since the government has now set a clear path forward with a determined endpoint to achieving the required energy mix to reach net zero by 2050, this presents businesses with a golden opportunity because the demand is confirmed. So one of the main areas which requires more focus is education in schools and colleges and universities. And there needs to be a clear path forward for students to follow to guide them into the clean energy sector. This must be done to encourage both men and women into the sector. Currently, well, there are already various energy clusters set up around the UK for offshore wind, for carbon capture, and for hydrogen projects. And this year, we saw in the spring budget, the government has demonstrated its commitment to the energy transition, such as new funding to develop world-class offshore wind hubs in Teesside and Humber, 8 new free ports around the UK, a new infrastructure bank to invest mainly in green projects. And all of this provides a fantastic opportunity for the UK, not only to support the green energy revolution at home, but by exporting to the global markets as well. We've seen the latest examples of new investments, such as GE have announced a new blade factory in Teesside, creating over 2,000 jobs. British Volt plans to open a new battery factory in Northumberland, creating over 3,500 jobs. And Humberside will receive 75 million in government investment for the marine energy park, which is on the south side of the Humber. And BP plan to build the largest UK blue hydrogen plant in Teesside, called H2 Teesside. So in the UK, we have a real advantage within the oil and gas industry. And the UK North Sea supports about 260,000 jobs with a subsea workforce of 45,000. We have an existing supply chain. We have decades of experience. We are used to managing large, complex offshore facilities. And we are the world leaders in moorings, in subsea flow lines and structures, control systems, cables, and connectors. Oil, and especially gas, will form part of the transition, since the transition to 100% renewables cannot occur overnight. Therefore, carbon capture will form a major part of the transition. And we see this as being a huge growth area, and Neil will go into this in a little bit more detail in his slides. The revised Oil and Gas Authority strategy came into force in February of this year, and this describes the net zero obligations of the industry, including reducing production emissions and supporting carbon capture and storage projects, and unlocking clean green hydrogen production. Now, the oil and gas majors' transition towards renewable energy has been very slow, but it is now accelerating. And we can see 14% of their 2021 budgets are now dedicated to renewables versus approximately 4% only 2 years ago in 2019. But of course, this needs to speed up. So looking to the future of the energy transition will depend on a group of like-minded businesses which will come together to make it happen, along with government legislation and education. And here at HKA, we are uniquely positioned to assist in this transition, as we have over 40 years experience in risk mitigation, in dispute avoidance and resolution. And we operate from 50 offices in 19 countries around the world. We have over 6,500 clients, and these include government agencies, local authorities, investors, developers, contractors, construction managers, and lawyers. Now, our vision is to make the energy transition to net zero emissions a success, but not just here in the UK. Because we need to make this a success globally around the world, because it is a global emergency, and we must all act now to make this happen. Part 2 of our energy transition webinars In part 2, my colleague Charles will explain to you how we use Crux to analyze our data in our past projects to determine the causation of where things typically go wrong and where we see the causation of failures in projects generally. We have compiled data to compare the oil and gas industry with the renewables industry, and Charles will go into this in more detail in part 2 of the energy transition webinars. So this brings me to the slide. So within the energy transition, there are 4 main sectors. We have wind energy, which is offshore and onshore. We have hydrogen, we have carbon capture and storage, and we have energy storage, which includes battery storage and hydrogen storage. And now I'd like to hand you over to Neil Golding, and Neil will explain to you the 4 main sectors involved in the energy transition, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in each of those sectors. So over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Kevin, for the introduction, and good morning all, and trust this finds you all safe and well. As mentioned, during the next 20 to 25 minutes, I'll provide you with some insight into what we at the EIC see happening in the energy transition currently. All of the data that I will be presenting has been taken directly from our project tracking database, EIC data stream. And there we go, excellent technologies allowing me to move forward. I won't dwell too much about us as an organisation. We are a not-for-profit trade association that helps support companies identify where there are global business opportunities across the energy sectors. And in this slide here, you can see some of the details and activities that we undertake. I'm primarily responsible for the market intelligence products that the EIC produces, and they are namely EIC Data Stream, EIC Asset Map, and EIC Supply Map. So let's get to the presentation itself. And first off, what I want to do is have a look at energy transition in terms of the purpose of this presentation, which looks at hydrogen, carbon capture, energy storage, and floating offshore wind. But what does need to be understood is that each country around the globe will have a different energy transition journey. We estimate that we will see upwards of $170 billion of capex in these 4 sectors around projects that have been announced to date, with the likelihood of this figure growing significantly throughout the decade. What we saw in 2020 was an unprecedented growth in announcement in these new sectors, dominated by energy storage, and the realization that with the continued growth in renewables, storage is going to be needed alongside these developments to ensure energy generated can be fully utilized. The hydrogen developments, green hydrogen, make up the bulk of announcements versus the blue hydrogen. And carbon capture, whilst relatively small in numbers, capex will be in the billions of dollars should developments move forward. There is recognition, and as Kevin mentioned, that carbon capture is needed to meet net zero targets. Excuse me, and is essential to decarbonise industry. And I will add further details on carbon capture in the UK later on in this presentation. What we are also seeing is oil and gas majors and NOCs more and more active in all of these sectors. So, in summary, on this slide, with the growth in announcements, you can see why investors, ministers, and lobby groups are getting excited about these industries and the opportunities that this may present in terms of future contracting activity. So first off, I want to take a look at offshore wind. Overall, there's 288 gigawatts of new capacity that could be added to the grid based on the developments that have been announced globally by 2030. Of this 288 gigawatts, some 261 gigawatts of capacity could be added using conventional fixed bottom technology, while 27.6 gigawatts of capacity could be installed through the development of floating offshore wind. Now, the total number of projects that are currently proposed stands at 466. Let's put this into context. At the end of 2020, we had 162 offshore wind farms in operation with a capacity of 32.5 gigawatts. Now, the UK is the global leader with 10.4 gigawatts capacity, followed by Germany with 7.7 and China with 7.1 gigawatts capacity. These free markets represent 75% of all producing capacity. And by the end of 2021, it is predicted that China will be the largest generator of electricity globally from offshore wind. What's clear is that there's huge growth potentially globally, and as costs continue to come down on the fixed bottom developments and the industry becomes commoditized, significant opportunities will also be seen in the floating offshore wind market. There are ambitions to drive local content in many of the markets to deliver and operate the projects. And those companies already with a track record in the sectors are generally preferred. However, given the huge scale up of the sector, opportunities will arise for new entrants into the market. And those contractors that have been involved in the offshore oil and gas market have the skill set and knowledge to transfer into these sectors. And that is what we've begun to see. No one technology, though, at the moment has been fixed upon for floating offshore wind, with technologies under development including spar, semi-sub, TLP and barge platforms. What is very clear is that the structures of these floating offshore wind farms will be sizable and will require well-developed port infrastructure and fabrication capabilities. But it isn't just the contractors that are making a move into the market. We now see big oil or big energy making the move into the sector, following the footsteps of Equinor, who are an established player in the offshore wind market. Shell, BP, Eni and Total are either leading the developments of offshore wind farms or forming joint venture partnerships with experienced developers on these projects. For example, BP and EnBW are aiming for a 7-year development process for the 2 lease sites that comprise the Elizabeth project that will be located in the Irish Sea and will have a total capacity of up to 3 gigawatts, with consent and construction start within 4 to 5 years. BP is looking at an 8 to 10% rate of return, aligned with shareholder expectations from renewables. Some players are seeing the role of traditional oil and gas companies into the market as a positive, with experience and transferable knowledge of how to develop and then operate in an offshore environment. However, others are concerned by the competition and the concern that we will see an increase in the costs of future auctions here in the UK, which could lead to an increase in the levelized cost of electricity as bids potentially increase. What we are beginning to see more and more of is the traditional oil and gas EPC contractors beginning to bid for work in the sector, including the likes now of McDermott and Sapura in Asia Pacific, where both organisations can utilise the existing fabrication facilities in the region. While closer to home, Bechtel has recently signed an agreement to partner with Hexagon in developing floating technology and will look to develop a 35 to 40 megawatt wind farm and establish how the technology could be brought to market, exploring the roles that the local suppliers could play in shipbuilding, mooring and installations, as well as the long-term serving needs of floating offshore wind. What is perhaps clear as well is that to deliver future projects, whether that be fixed bottom or floating offshore wind, new players throughout the supply chain will likely have a role to play in delivering projects. And with the new players, will we see a change in the traditional offshore wind tendering exercises, which are multi-contract EPC, or with the entrance of major oil and gas operators, will we see a move towards a lump sum turnkey contracting model? At the moment, there's no sign yet of what the approach will be. Also, when it comes to tendering and pre-qualification exercises in the future, and this isn't exclusive to offshore wind suppliers, offshore wind suppliers will be asked to show how they are reducing carbon emissions on the pathway to net zero. What needs to be communicated to the supply chain is how this will be done and what weighting will be behind low carbon products, or will price still be the winner? Now I'd like to focus on the UK specifically, and the UK is currently the world leader in offshore wind developments, thanks to world-class regulation and policies that have been developed. The development of the supply chain was helped eventually by clear vision of the government, and as a consequence of this, the pipeline of opportunities that came through. It was not always the case that the UK had a clear direction in the market. It must be noted that while the UK has excellent capability in front-end services, digital cables, subsea and operations and maintenance, initial differing on policy and feed-in tariffs and a lack of a pipeline of opportunity initially meant the UK supply chain did not develop what I would term the big ticket items in the sector. Other than turbine blades, Siemens, of course, components for the wind turbines are imported from Europe. The large offshore structures are fabricated overseas, as the UK has lacked the capabilities or investment in port or fabrication infrastructure. And the UK has become a market for assembly rather than manufacturing. The map on the right-hand side here indicates that 896 companies in the UK that we have mapped through EIC Supply Map that have proven capabilities in the offshore wind sector and have a revenue of over £1 million. So it shows that there's a good spread throughout the UK in our offshore wind capabilities. Now, the UK, as Kevin mentioned, has got a 10-point plan and emphasised the importance of offshore wind in the UK. As previously indicated, the UK has ambitious targets and plans to quadruple its capacity to 40 gigawatts total installed by 2030, and seen several of the energy majors take part in the latest auctions. To deliver this additional 30 gigawatts and the remaining tens of gigawatts proposed in Europe, significant opportunities will present themselves to the supply chain and will require both public and private investment in facilities. Now, £95 million of government investment was also made for 2 new offshore wind ports, which were announced on the 10th of March. As Kevin mentioned, the Able Marine Energy Park on the south bank of the River Humber will receive up to £75 million of government investment, and Tees Works on an offshore manufacturing centre on the River Tees will benefit from up to £20 million. Now, construction will begin later this year to upgrade the ports with new infrastructure, and as previously mentioned, GE Renewable will be opening yet another wind blade manufacturing facility, and this is due to open and start production in 2023. A question that has been asked in sessions that I have moderated myself around wind, offshore wind, is whether the supply chain will be able to deliver the 60% UK content in offshore wind. It is great to have the ambition, but given current capabilities, it will be difficult to succeed. Concerns again that costs may be driven up by using the UK supply chain, and also, as Kevin alluded to, the lack of skills. However, between the round 4 leases being awarded to being approved gives the UK an opportunity to attract inward investment or utilise government funds to further establish UK supply chain capability. But let's not forget, offshore wind is going to be just one part of the multi-million-pound investments in energy projects and infrastructure and development in the UK over the course of the decade. And suppliers should look at all of these new sectors. So I want to start off first off by talking about hydrogen. And I'm hoping that everyone understands the difference between green hydrogen, which is produced and generated from renewables, and blue hydrogen, which is produced using gas. And what we've already seen is green hydrogen strategies have already been rolled out in overseas markets, namely Australia, the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, and France. The UK has yet to roll out a strategy, but it is imminent. And what we're also seeing is blue hydrogen being talked about in some of the oil markets, such as the US. Now, Australia plans to decarbonise its energy landscape whilst establishing itself as a major hydrogen exporter and has built already partnerships with Japan, South Korea, Germany, and Singapore. The Netherlands, where we see here, the main aim in the short and medium term is to decarbonise industry and shipping, which is the reason why we'll find a significant number of projects located at ports such as Rotterdam or in Groningen. And in Germany, Germany is focused on decarbonising industry. A lot of projects are being developed at on-site refineries, steel manufacturing plants, and petrochemical facilities. Cumulatively, on the projects that have been announced, we're expecting to see $48 billion of investment over the next 5 years. And what this looks like over the next 5 years is investment increasing almost 6-fold between 2021 and 2025. The low level initially, as we work from demo to small scale developments to the large commercial scale developments. And with a UK focus, skipped. Thank you. The UK supply chain has significant capabilities that can be transferred into the hydrogen sector. In fact, we've identified over 1,900 companies that can provide services and equipment in the hydrogen sector that currently work in the energy sectors. Standards will likely need to be developed for some equipment due to the challenges of working with hydrogen, especially around embrittlement. What is clear is that the supply chain is very excited by hydrogen. A clear pipeline of opportunities is required, as well as government support. We're already, thankfully, able to see many of these blue hydrogen projects, which are closely linked to the CCUS projects that have recently been announced and I'll touch upon in the next slide. There will be significant infrastructure requirements, whether that be new build or modification of existing. However, challenges in reusing existing infrastructure is going to be, like I say, it's a challenge due to, especially for pure hydrogen in the future. Now, huge ambitions have been set out by the government. The UK is aiming for 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production capacity by 2030, with 1 gigawatt capacity hoped for by 2025. A hydrogen strategy is set to be announced during Q2 of this year. And while not first mover in terms of the announcement, the UK will be at the forefront of new capacity additions. In conjunction with the launch of the strategy, the consultation will begin on the government's preferred business models for hydrogen. The UK government will create a £240 million net zero hydrogen fund to provide capital co-investment in the range of production technologies that will be required to satisfy the level of anticipated demand for clean hydrogen by 2050. The technologies which the UK government hopes to invest in include methane reformation with CCUS, biomass gasification, again with carbon capture, utilisation and storage, and electrolytic hydrogen using renewable or nuclear generated electricity. The government is hoping to attract over £4 billion of private investment in the period of up to 2030. With the investment in production technologies and getting in early, the opportunity exists for the UK supply chain to be a leading player globally in hydrogen capabilities. The next step is working with industry. We could see up to 20% blending of hydrogen into the grid by 2023. And further to the announcements, hubs where renewable energy, carbon capture and hydrogen congregate will put industrial super places at the front of these technological developments. But it's not just about the UK, and in Scotland, the Hydrogen Action Plan is to be announced later this year with input from local enterprise agencies, which will set out how we will implement our hydrogen policies and will be accompanied by £100 million worth of investment. Now, I want to move on to carbon capture, utilisation and storage. And it's interesting to look back at CCUS, which is not a new technology, of course. It has a checkered history of government policies supporting and then reversing that support, as we saw in the last decade, where support for Longanic was removed and the project then shelved. What's happened here is supply chain remains nervous because of this. But there is now current renewed interest in the industry, and this is linked very much to industry emissions capture, as well as blue hydrogen. The UK as a whole leads the way in terms of the number of developments and CapEx. It is clear that it has a critical role to play in terms of a drive to net zero and decarbonising industry. As mentioned in the introduction, relatively few announcements have been made to date. However, we are beginning to see further developments being announced, including bioenergy, CCS projects known as BECCS, and CCF off the back of LNG liquefaction facilities, notably in the US market. CCS is not for every market at the moment and geography. However, with more developments will come greater experience, which in turn will drive down costs in the sector as we move to nth of a kind rather than first of a kind developments. So during this next slide, I want to focus on why this time is different for carbon capture, one of which is the climate emergency and recognition by industry and governments that something needs to be done now. Work is already underway to identify the UK supply chain gaps, and we've identified almost 3,000 companies that have been involved or could get involved in the carbon capture and storage market. The UK, this work that we've undertaken in mapping the potential supply chain has enabled us to identify that across all elements of a project, capture, transport and storage, the UK supply chain has significant existing capabilities that can be transferred into the industry. However, there are a couple of things that companies need to be mindful of. There is not yet a clear contracting model that's been outlined. Oil and gas operators want to set the standards, while other players involved may look to the supply chain to set the standards for these developments. And also recognition needs to be given that this is not an oil and gas business. Low margins are expected for the supply chain. And what is clear, it will be very beneficial for everyone to share knowledge in the development of projects to drive costs down in the future. The 10-point plan also pointed out why this time is different. The £1 billion Carbon Capture Utilisation and Storage Infrastructure Fund has been established to support 4 industrial clusters, 2 by mid-2020 and 4 sites by 2030, and provides the certainty that is required to deploy CCUS at pace and scale. Details to be announced in 2021 on the revenue mechanism to bring private sector investment into industrial carbon capture and hydrogen products via new business models to support these projects as well. And developments of the business models will be announced in 2022. The government announced on the 17th of March as well that £171 million from the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge has been allocated to 9 green tech projects in Scotland, South Wales, the North West, Humber and Teesside in England to undertake engineering and design studies for the rollout of decarbonisation infrastructure, such as carbon capture, usage and storage and hydrogen. Funding from the challenge will drive industrial decarbonisation whilst enhancing productivity for these regions to create new jobs for a low carbon future. This challenge is the first active funding stream as part of a wider government commitment to cut industrial emissions. It will develop at least 1 low carbon industrial cluster by 2030 and the world's first net zero carbon industrial cluster by 2040 in support of the industrial cluster's mission. It is not just the UK government that has provided funding, and projects supporting the development of CCS and non-emitting technologies could also access £80 million of funding made available by the Scottish Government. And it is also worth noting that the UK bioenergy strategy that is set to be announced in 2020 will also include bioenergy and carbon capture projects as part of that initiative. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of these projects. This is just an indication of what we're seeing in terms of those developments moving forward in hydrogen and carbon capture around the sector. And the map here, like I say, shows those developments that are currently underway. What is clear is collaboration is going to be key. Multiple players from different sectors are involved in each development. We see oil and gas majors, utilities, technology, and industrial players involved in CCUS and hydrogen projects. I just want to touch briefly, though, on one particular project, and the 3 particular projects, sorry, and that's Net Zero Teesside, the Northern Endurance Partnership, which will receive over £52 million of investment that aim to decarbonise the Teesside industrial cluster in the mid-2020s, and over £21 million is available for the Zero Carbon Humber Partnership project, which aims to turn the Humber region into a net zero cluster by 2040. The first project that will be developed will be the Equinor-led H2H Saltend low carbon hydrogen facility and a hydrogen and carbon dioxide pipeline network across Humber industrial sites developed by National Grid Venture. Now, Equinor is involved in all of these projects, and this is a great example of public-private partnerships working. The 3 successful bids amount to a total of £229 million in private and public funding, with Equinor and its partners contributing more than 2/3 of the total. So I think it's clear to see that this time is very different for carbon capture. And then finally, in terms of the sectors, I just want to touch upon now energy storage. And despite the development of new technologies gathering pace, it is worth noting that of the over 180 gigawatts of operational energy storage capacity, the majority of this continues to be in pumped hydro. As pointed out, energy storage is set to grow and see some significant investment over the next 5 years, which is not a surprise as the investment in renewables continues at pace, as comes with the maturity of technology costs continue to come down, especially around battery systems, which are typically at the moment lithium-ion based. However, the sector is not without its issues, and there are some raw material risks and some supply and demand concerns that are currently being spoken about. The US is seeing the most significant number of developments being proposed, with most linked again to new build onshore wind and solar developments. Again, the more mature developed technologies lead the way. However, it is worth pointing out that new technologies are currently under development, including liquid air energy storage and compressed air energy storage. Now, there are a number of drivers that are leading this investment in energy storage. There's a growth of electric vehicle markets, which is set to be seen throughout the globe. We will continue to see renewables integration and the need for grid flexibility. They are, as previously mentioned, co-located with existing onshore solar and wind facilities. But there's also the element that can be utilised for commercial, industrial and residential electricity optimisation. There will, though, be some challenges, and that includes the replacement for transmission network upgrades. But we will continue to see ongoing cost reductions and improved technologies. But I think one thing that is apparent is that there are still limitations and risks of battery storage technology. And there is also a need to increase the capacity dispatch to greater than 5 hours. And then finally, in terms of the UK, well, currently we have a project pipeline of over 13.5 gigawatts with approximately 1.3 gig ready to build and 5.7 gigawatts consented and a further 6.5 gigawatts proposed. And in March 2020, we have currently in the UK 3.9 gigawatts of which is operational, of which 862 megawatts for battery storage. We saw the planning law changed on the 2nd of December in the UK, which now allows energy storage projects over 50 megawatts to come online without going through the national planning process. This means storage projects above 50 megawatts in England and 350 megawatts in Wales can proceed without approval through the national planning regime. During March 2021, an announcement was made that £68 million is to be provided to further developments for energy storage technologies. And the UK are considering 3 key technology categories across both streams: power to X, thermal and electric. All demonstrations would be expected to demonstrate flexibility services to and from the grid, and solutions with UK commercial deployments would be out of scope, and that would include lithium-ion, pumped hydro and water tanks. The competition could encompass energy storage technologies that could be deployed at large scale, could provide competitive flexibility services and systems benefits for the electricity system, and provide longer duration storage capability, over 4 hours. And now to my final slide, and a bit of a reality check in this respect. So clean tech sectors will quite rightly see a continued increase in the number of developments being announced, and are getting increasing support from the majors, investors and governments alike. However, in terms of business opportunities for the supply chain and spend as of today, you can see the mature hydrocarbon markets will continue to dominate expenditure. Of the investment that is set to be made during the next 5 years across all of the energy sectors, energy transition will make up just 2% of the global capex. This 2% equates to approximately $130 billion compared to the $4.2 trillion to be spent in the mature hydrocarbon and power sectors, and $1.6 trillion that will be spent on the conventional renewable sectors. A stable oil price will see more oil and gas projects move forward, while investment in commoditized renewables is set to continue to grow as developing markets take the first step on their energy transition journey. In this COP26 year, it will be interesting to see how momentum for clean tech sectors continues to grow. But what is clear is that oil and gas will still have a pivotal role in the future energy mix, and investments will continue in the sector for the foreseeable future. And that is the end of my presentation, and I think we've now got time for Q&A.
Hi, Kevin. It's sorry, Neil. It's Trevor here. And one of the questions that's come in is regarding, you mentioned a 60% UK content target. Could you just explain that? Is that an aspiration, or is there some kind of regulation to support that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is being looked at as being introduced as part of the contract for difference mechanism in offshore wind going forward. So I think it's partly aspirational, but also I feel that there could be a weighting that's set against this in future auctions going forward. Whether or not that's achievable, as I mentioned, I think we've got to see some significant investments in the sector, and in particular in the port infrastructure and also fabrication facilities, for us to be able to deliver what I would see are the big ticket items in this area.
Okay, good. Just looking at the questions again coming in, Kevin, you spoke about the supply chain somewhat, and then Neil kind of expanded on that. But do you see the supply chain for these emerging markets as being a potentially slowing force if they don't develop fast enough?
Sorry, can you hear me okay? I think I was
Yes.
on mute. Yeah, so if you look at, the advancement, for example, if you just look at offshore wind, if you look at how long it took the UK to get to the current capacity, which is around about 12 gigawatt goal capacity. So if we need to then increase, the capacity to 40 gigawatt, which is nearly a 30 gigawatt increase in the next 9 years, then that's going to be some struggle. And part of the problem is not just the existing supply chain, it's bringing in new players into the supply chain, and also of course we're going to hit as we mentioned before, a skill shortage as well. So there's going to be a requirement, and what I was trying to point out before is we already have a fantastic workforce available of the oil and gas industry, which needs to be utilized to make the move into the new supply chains. And I think that's going to be a fundamental factor, as well as education. Education from schools and colleges and universities is going to also be a major factor. So all of this will affect the supply chain, but yes, of course, it's going to be a struggle, not just in the UK, but globally as well.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Neil, a question just come in regarding the potential effect of Brexit. Do you see Brexit being relevant at all to the supply chain here, or are we ploughing a different furrow?
That's a very interesting question. And do I see Brexit having an impact? I think what we may well see is the possibility and hopefully the potential for investment and perhaps the increase in UK capability here within the UK. Do I feel that we're going to be able to negate? What I would suggest, and certainly what I'm seeing and working with partners across the other side of the North Sea in particular, is that we are seeing this as a one North Sea issue, the whole energy transition piece. So I feel that what we will probably see is not necessarily the impacts, but we will see more collaboration going forward with some of our European players. That's what I would like to hope for anyway.
Okay, fair enough. And we've had a similar question based on COVID. What effect do you feel that's had in terms of, has that even had an accelerating effect on the transition? Perhaps Kevin, could you address that?
Yeah, I think it has, because I think the whole the approach, the people's attitude to the pandemic and the effect on building back greener, which the UK government is hanging the recovery on, is an important factor, and we can build back greener. It's an ideal opportunity after this pandemic to change course and invest, as the government is doing, in green renewables, as we mentioned earlier on. So the ability and the opportunity, which is here now, to build greener after the pandemic is a fantastic opportunity. And I think it's time people now, we are realizing the effect of the devastation. If you look now currently what's happening in Australia with a huge amount of flooding, last year they had a massive amount of fires as a result of the increase in temperatures. People are now much more aware of what is needed to be done, to combat climate change. And the pandemic, I think, in my opinion, has come at at the right time, if you want to put it in that context, to take the opportunity to build back greener. And the transition to move from fossil fuels has to happen now. And as Neil showed on his slides, it is gathering momentum, but it needs to speed up. It needs to speed up rapidly. And that scaling up is going to be the biggest hurdle we're going to face. So, yeah, in my opinion, yes. Over to you, Neil.
I think it's refocused the minds, has COVID, for a lot of energy players as well, especially those oil majors. I think the oil price impact once again, and what we saw there, we see this continual fluctuation historically in the oil price, where what we can see with renewables, etc., is that return on investment that you can almost guarantee, that 8 to 10%, rather than this cyclical nature that we see in oil and gas. So I think that has also been an enabler, and that is, of course, because of COVID that we saw the drop in the oil price. But I think we were already beginning to see momentum, certainly in the UK, around the resulting climate emergency that we're absolutely in right now, and hitting net zero targets. And that is, I think, it's also aided to a certain extent by the fact that certainly here in the UK, we want to be seen as world leaders. And with COP26 coming up, what a great message to get out to the world, that actually the UK is at the forefront of not just the technologies, but also the projects to enable not just the UK to reach its net zero targets, but also other countries to decarbonise as well going forward.
Okay, a couple of questions coming in on how the oil companies will perform in a different market. You mentioned, Neil, different forms of contract kicking around, and also the relatively lower rates of return from these projects, other than from what oil and gas companies have traditionally been used to in the hydrocarbon markets. Where do you feel it will go in terms of contracting strategy?
Do you want to tackle that one first, Kevin? It's a really good question, Trevor, and a particularly difficult one.
Well, one thing, if I can add something there, just from my own experience in oil and gas. Although the oil industry is cyclic, the margins are generally very high, and the rates of return are staggering in some projects. This is new territory, and we've seen Dong morph themselves into Ørsted quite successfully, but they were, in basis, a national oil company to start with. You've mentioned Equinor a few times, who are very, very forward-thinking in this, and have played a lead role both in carbon capture and storage in terms of the technology development, and also in offshore wind, as you said. But is that going to be the case with all operators? The oil and gas industry at the moment is made of majors, super majors, but also an awfully large population of smaller operators. You see them making the transition? Perhaps Graham and Kevin could comment on that. Do you see the smaller players moving in this direction, or staying with hydrocarbons?
In my opinion, yes. I think once people understand the market, the potential of the market, as Neil was saying, yes, you will see that move. And it has been a slow transition, but not all companies are taking the same approach. For example, if you look at BP have a different approach. Total have a different approach to Shell going into the renewables market. But I think it's understanding the opportunities and the profit to be made in this transition into renewables. And it is taking time to gather momentum, but I do think across the board, and I certainly hope so, that all companies will get on board, to raise their investments and take advantage of the fantastic opportunities which are going to come forward. So, yeah. Anything you want to add, Graham?
Only that, of course, there will be different strategies by different companies, because, of course, there are large NOCs that can more or less do what the government tells them to, but then there are companies that are IOCs that have investors that want a return on their investment. However, I will add to that, of course, many investment advisors have clients that are now looking for investment that's considered more socially responsible and environmentally respective.
I think, Graham, that would have been the point that I would have picked up on here, is the investment element. That is going to be a significant challenge going forward for everyone. You just have to look at the pressure right now that UK Export Finance, for example, is under in terms of supporting overseas projects that are linked to oil and gas. Now, that is going to be a challenge for, going forward in terms of things like Mozambique LNG. Is this just the start of these export credit agencies taking a step back from funding and supporting these large-scale developments? And if we see, are there others that are going to take the similar lead? And I think as well, unless it's private equity, getting investment right now from banks for the smaller players in the oil and gas is going to be a huge challenge, an absolutely monumental challenge. So I think some of these smaller players, Trevor, to pick up on the question, I think that they will have to adapt. They will have to go on that journey to energy transition. And to a certain extent, we're beginning to see that with the electrification in the North Sea and the proposals that are being made around that, and some of the smaller operators making those changes and making that, on that pathway already. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I think that it's one, political will and social responsibility that companies will take on.
Yeah, I think it's, as you just said, it's economic pressure and environmental pressure, as well as that social responsibility, which will force the move, if you like, long term.
The governments have their part to play there as well, and we see, for example, the huge country called America that has a flipping policy overnight from one president to the next. So that's always going to be a challenge, and that will remain a challenge in countries that are less well off than the developed world.
Yes, definitely. Yes.
So just to finish off a question, Justin, and we focused on this is a business opportunity for oil and gas companies making the transition into here, and also for the supply chain, both in the UK and globally. But in terms of ongoing hydrocarbon production, the question here is, what impact will the need to be greener in terms of production operations have on the oil and gas industry at this time? Do you see that as a major overview?
Yeah, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a new revised strategy coming in force in the UK by the Oil and Gas UK, which basically is putting pressure on them to change, and to adopt a greener, cleaner way forward. So they need to meet these obligations. So that came into practice, or it came into force February this year. So yes, they're going to have to, and as Graham said, so governments need to force companies within their, within a jurisdiction to follow those changes.
And I think it goes further down the food chain as. Sorry, I think it goes further down the food chain as well. It's not just about the production element here; it's the supplying of equipment and services as well. That all has a role to play, and what we're beginning to see the EPC putting this incentive right now on show for the supply chain as part of pre-qualification exercises, showing that the suppliers are lowering their emissions as well to help these contractors on their journey to net zero. So I think as a whole, yes, we're absolutely going to see the oil and gas industry greening up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I think it's significant as well to see that the analyst reports that now you see on service companies, for instance, so mention the environmental and social governance aspects of their appraisals more and more as you see them come out. Kevin, I'm conscious that we're just about on the hour. Is that? Yeah. Are there any closing remarks for you?
Well, I hope it's been useful for everyone, for the audience who's attended. I mean, I think it's been fascinating from my perspective, and I want to thank you all, especially Neil, for putting all that work together. It's been really informative, and you know, the presentation will be made available to all attendees. And I just want to thank those all for attending, and thank you all for being panelists. Thank you.
Any questions that haven't been answered will be answered by email.
Sure, we will do. So it just remains for me to say thanks again and goodbye until part 2. And part 2, the dates for part 2 will be announced shortly. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.